The water wasn't water anymore. It was a churning brown fist that had spent the last 12 hours crushing every upright thing in Mercy Flats into splinters and mud. Elias Vance heard the cry over the river's dying roar. Not an animal. Human. A child's whimper, thin and desperate, clinging to a torn scrap of roof in the wreckage. He was waist-deep in the cold, pulling her free before he'd even made the choice. And in that moment, a man with nothing to his name made a promise to a girl who had lost everything. Elias Vance was a drifter, a man who moved to outrun the memories that followed him. Mercy Flats was just another name on a map until the flood made it a grave for 47 souls. The girl he pulled from the river was the only one left. Now, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a vow between them, they face a single, brutal question. How do you rebuild a world from nothing? Mercy Flats hadn't been much, but it had been a place. A dozen families, a blacksmith, a trading post run by a man named Silas that served as a saloon, a church, and a town hall all in one. They'd chosen the flat river bend for the good soil, ignoring the old trapper warnings about the spring rage of the Ghost River. Elias Vance had ridden in 2 days before the sky broke. He was just passing through, looking for a few days' work mending fences or breaking horses before moving south. He carried a Union Army discharge paper from 1865 that was fraying at the edges, a grief for a wife and infant son buried back in Ohio that was not, and a rule: never stay long enough for roots to find purchase. The storm started at dusk, not a gentle rain, but a wall of water that fell for 12 hours without pause. By midnight, the Ghost River leapt its banks. What followed wasn't a flood, it was an erasure. The force of it plucked buildings from their foundations, swept wagons and livestock and people into a roaring, chaotic darkness. Elias spent those hours trapped on the second floor of the livery stable with 3 other men and a screaming horse, listening to the world dissolve. Dawn revealed a nightmare. Where a town had been, there was only a vast, debris-choked lake. A single chimney stood like a tombstone. Bodies began to surface as the water receded over the next day. They buried them in a mass grave on the high ridge, 23 they could find, the rest simply gone. Among the missing was the family of the little girl. Her name was Lily. She was 4 years old. Her mother, father, and older brother had been in their cabin when the wall of water hit. Lily had been swept out through a window, somehow ending up tangled in the wreckage of her own roof, a tiny island in the ruin. Elias knew nothing about children. His own son had never drawn a full day's breath. The loss had hollowed him out, sent him wandering west to outpace the ghost of what might have been. Holding Lily, who shook with cold and a silence more terrible than any cry, he felt that old fracture in his chest threaten to split wide open. But he'd made a promise into her hair as he carried her from the riverbank. "I've got you," he'd said, a vow as much to the memory of his own child as to her. "I'm not letting go." The immediate problem was survival. The flood had stripped the land. The trading post cellar was submerged, its supplies ruined. Elias' own gear, his bedroll, his tools, his spare ammunition, was at the bottom of the livery, now a soup of mud and splintered wood. They had the clothes on their backs, his knife, and the half-empty canteen on his saddle. His horse, a stubborn bay gelding named Judge, had survived on the ridge. For 3 days they scavenged. Elias fashioned a crude linta from salvaged timber and torn canvas. He found a rusted pot, a waterlogged sack of beans that he dried in the sun. He taught Lily how to look for crawfish in the new mudflats. She spoke only once on the second day, pointing at a broken doll half buried in the muck. "Mine," she whispered, then retreated back into her silence. The 4th morning brought the first outside visitor. A man rode into the devastation on a fine dappled mare, picking his way through the debris with the cautious distaste of someone stepping over manure. He introduced himself as Everett Shaw, land agent for the Western Territories Development Company. He wore a clean suit and carried a leather satchel. "Terrible tragedy," Shaw said, not looking at the graves on the ridge. "The company extends its sympathies." He explained that the WTDC held speculative liens on several plots in the valley, including, it turned out, the very land Mercy Flats had occupied. A lien was a claim, a financial foothold. With the settlers deceased or scattered, the company's claim now edged toward full ownership. "We'll be surveying for a proper rail depot come summer," Shaw said. "This valley's the logical pass. Shame about the flood, but it clears the way." Elia's stirring beans over a small fire, Lily watching from the lean-to entrance, felt a cold clarity cut through his exhaustion. "These people aren't even cold in the ground. You're talking about a depot." "Progress, Mr. Vance. It's inevitable. The railroad is coming. This settlement was always temporary." Shaw's eyes flicked to Lily. "A child shouldn't be in a place like this. There's an orphanage in Fort James 3 days' ride. They'd see to her placement." The word placement hung in the air like a threat. Elias knew what that meant: indentured servitude, a childhood of labor, or worse. The institutional machinery of the territory, such as it was, saw orphans as burdens to be auctioned off as cheap labor. "That's not happening," Elias said, his voice low. Shaw smiled a thin, professional smile. "You're not kin. You've no legal standing. You're a transient found on company-leased land with a child that is not yours. The marshal in Fort James would be very interested in that scenario." He tipped his hat. "Think on it. I'll be back in a week to begin initial survey. The child belongs in proper care. This land belongs to the future." As Shaw rode away, the first true spark of defiance ignited in Elias. It wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about a claim. A claim to this child and to the memory of the place that had been her home. But he was one man with a gun, a knife, and a handful of beans, against a company with paper claims and railroad money. That afternoon, a second miracle arrived. Not from the sky, but from the mud. Old man Harkness, the blacksmith, had not died in the flood. Grizzled and built like a stump, he'd been up in the high pines cutting timber when the rain started and been trapped for a week by washed-out trails. He returned to find his forge a pile of scrap, but his hands still worked. He was the first piece of the town to walk back out of the grave. Then 2 days later, the Carson sisters appeared. Me and June, 120, the other 17, had been visiting a relative downstream. They returned to utter loss, their parents, their home. They found Elias, Lily, and Harkness trying to straighten nails from the wreckage. They didn't weep, they rolled up their sleeves. Me had her mother's seed packets, salvaged from a high cupboard. June had a fierce, practical energy. A group was coalescing. Not a town, not yet. A stubborn kernel of survivors. Harkness could rebuild a forge. The Carson sisters knew farming. Elias could hunt, build, and fight. And Lily was the reason. She was the living heart of the place they were all suddenly fighting for. But Everett Shaw's deadline loomed. A week. Elias knew showing up at Fort James to assert any right would end with Lily in the orphanage and himself in jail or run out of town. They had to prove a different kind of claim. A claim of presence, of improvement, of a community reborn. But the law cared about paper, not sentiment. Harkness provided the first real tool. From the rubble of his forge, he salvaged a heavy anvil, cracked but usable. "Company man wants this land clear," he grunted, setting the anvil on a stump. "We start putting things back. He can't just sweep us aside so easy. Squatters' rights got some weight if we're stubborn enough." So they began, not with houses but with a declaration. They cleared a patch of ground. Harkness and Elias raised a post, and on it they nailed a sign painted with salvaged tar, "Mercy Flats." The letters were crude, defiant. Lily placed her small hand on the fresh wood. It felt like a beginning, but Elias, lying awake that night listening to the river's subdued murmur, knew it was a fragile one. Shaw would be back. He had the law, or a version of it, on his side. They had a sign, an anvil, 2 grieving sisters, an old blacksmith, a drifter, and a traumatized child. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. 5 days after Shaw's visit, a rider approached from the north, not the south where Fort James lay. This man was lean, dressed in worn buckskin, and he carried a long rifle across his saddle. He was a trapper named Ants, a man who lived deep in the mountains and came to Mercy Flats twice a year for supplies. He took in the devastation, the single leaning sign, the small group by the fire with dark, knowing eyes. He shared a rabbit from his pack, listening as Elias told him of Shaw and the company. Ants spat into the fire. WTDC, he muttered. Vultures, they got lions all through this valley. Bought 'em cheap from a speculator who stole 'em from the tribes with a barrel of bad whiskey and a broken treaty. He looked at Elias. That lien on the town site, the one Shaw's waving around, it's contested. The speculator who sold it to the company, fella named Dobbs, he sold the same mineral rights to a mining consortium back east. Different paper, same land. It's a mess. A lawyer's feast. Elias' mind raced. Contested? You mean the company's claim isn't solid? Solid as mud, Ant said, but they got more money for lawyers and for persuasion. He nodded toward the woods. They'll use the law first. If that's slow, they'll send men who don't bother with law, seen it before. Here was a sliver of hope and a much larger threat. The company's legal ground was shaky, but that made them more dangerous, not less. A corporation with a questionable claim and a railroad to build doesn't just walk away. It finds other means to clear obstacles. The very next morning, as the mist rose off the river, the Means arrived. 2 riders. They weren't dressed like Shaw. They wore rough trail clothes and carried pistols openly. They stopped 100 yards from the lean-to, eyeing the sign, the anvil, the thin plume of smoke from the fire. They didn't approach. They just watched. Then, as silently as they came, they turned and rode back south. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message was clear. The week of grace was over. The persuasion had begun. Elias looked at Lily, who was clutching her salvaged doll, her eyes wide and fixed on the spot where the men had been. He looked at the faces of his makeshift family, Harkness's stony resolve, Mee's fearful determination, June's angry flush. They had built a sign. They had built a fire. But they were exposed, vulnerable, and now they were being watched. He had vowed to rebuild everything she lost. But to do that, he would no longer just be a builder. He would have to become a defender. And he knew with a cold certainty that the first test was not a week away. It would come tonight. Elias didn't wait for dark. He sent the Carson sisters and Lily with Harkness up to a hidden overhang he'd scouted in the pines, a defensible spot with one narrow approach. Then he and Judge moved into the tree line downwind of the lean-to, and he waited. The 2 riders from that morning were amateurs. They'd shown themselves. Men sent to do ugly work in the night wouldn't have done that. So Elias watched for others. He didn't have to wait long. An hour past sundown, 3 shapes detached from the shadows near the riverbank. They moved toward the lean-to with a focused, quiet intent. They carried coiled rope and cloth sacks, not guns. Their tools were for kidnapping, not killing. They meant to take Lily, and likely the sisters too, and make it look like they'd just vanished in the dangerous wilderness. A clean solution for the WTDC. Elias had left a dummy shape under a blanket by the fire. As the lead man bent to grab it, Elias stepped from the trees, the click of his revolver's hammer a stark sound in the quiet. Evening. What followed wasn't a shootout. It was a tense, whispered negotiation at gunpoint. The men, hired muscle from a rough mining camp to the south, had been promised $20 a head for runaways. They weren't ideologues, they were poor men doing a dirty job. Elias, with the advantage of surprise and a steady aim, offered a counter-proposal. You ride back. You tell Shaw you found the place empty, picked clean by scavengers. You still get your 20 from him for the report, or you don't ride back at all. He could see the calculation in their eyes under the starlight. The risk-reward ratio had just shifted violently. They dropped their ropes and backed away, melting back into the darkness. Elias stood trembling, not from fear, but from the rush of averted violence. He had won the night by bluff and positioning, but he'd also shown his hand. Shaw would know the survivors weren't helpless, and the next attempt wouldn't be so gentle. The group reconvened at the overhang at first light. The crisis had broken something open. They were no longer just survivors huddled together. They were a council of war. Mee Carson, her face pale but determined, spoke the truth aloud. They won't stop. They wanted to take us. Next time they'll just burn us out. Harkness, pounding a fist into his palm, growled, "We need walls, a stockade, a place they can't just walk into." But Elias' mind was on the trapper Ance's words. The company's claim was contested. That was their real weakness. "Walls won't stop a marshal with a court order," he said. "We need a different kind of defense. We need proof." They split their forces. Harkness and June would begin fortifying the overhang, creating a defensible camp. Elias and me would ride to Fort James. Me, because she could read and write, and because she remembered her father talking about a deed locked in a strongbox under their cabin floor. If it survived the flood, it was a piece of paper that proved her family's claim, which might conflict with the company's lien. Fort James was a raw, booming supply town of 2,000 souls, all dust and ambition. It stank of manure, sawdust, and unwashed humanity. Elias felt exposed immediately, a known face in a crowded street. They went to the land office first, a cramped room reeking of ink and sweat. A board clerk confirmed the WTDC had filed a lien on the Mercy Flats town site, but when me asked to see the original documentation, he shrugged. "Company files are private. You'd need a judge to subpoena that." As they turned to leave, a man leaning against the doorframe straightened up. He was middle-aged, with the weary eyes of a civil servant and a faded star on his vest. Deputy Marshal Clay Burgess. "Heard there were folks squatting up at Mercy Flats," he said, his tone neutral. "You'd be them." Elias met his gaze. "We're rebuilding. On contested land. There's a company man, Shaw, filing complaints. Says you're harboring a kidnapped child." Burgess's eyes flicked to me. "Makes for serious paperwork." This was the legal front of the war Elias had feared. A marshal doing his duty, backed by the company's version of the facts. Elias knew he couldn't win a direct confrontation here. The child's family died in the flood. There's no one else. We're protecting her. Protection's one thing. Legal guardianship's another. That requires a judge. And a judge will look at a drifter with no fixed address and a company with a legal claim and a plan for a railroad depot. Burgess wasn't threatening. He was explaining the mechanics of the system, and it was crushing. "My advice: bring the child to the orphanage. Let the courts sort it. You stay up there, and next time I ride out, it won't be for a conversation." They left the land office with the weight of the territory's authority settling on their shoulders. The law, or its local manifestation, was aligning with the company. Their next stop was the newspaper, the Fort James Sentinel. Me had an idea. If they couldn't fight with guns or legal briefs, perhaps they could fight with public opinion. The editor, a thin man named Price with ink-stained fingers, listened to their story with a skeptic's ear until me mentioned the contested lien and the attempted kidnapping. "Shaw, WTDC," Price's eyes sharpened. "They've been trying to buy up my press for 6 months. I don't like bullies." He agreed to write an editorial but warned them. "It'll stir the pot, might bring you sympathizers, might also make Shaw decide to finish the job quick before the story spreads." They were gathering pieces, but none formed a complete shield. As they prepared to leave town, a voice called from a shadowed alley. "Vance." It was Ance the trapper. He gestured them into the gloom. "You're poking a hornet's nest. Burgess is a company man. His brother's a surveyor for the WTDC, the marshal here. He's on retainer." "We figured," Elias said. Ance leaned closer. "Then here's something you didn't figure. That lien Shaw's waiving. The speculator Dobbs didn't just double-sell the mineral rights. He never had clear title to begin with. The land was part of a treaty grant to the Iron Mountain Band. The treaty's disputed, but the band's chief, Walking Bear, he's got a copy signed by a territorial governor. He's been fighting the company in the federal courts back east for 2 years." This was the pivot. The ground shifted under Elias' feet. This wasn't just a conflict between settlers and a company. It was the tail end of a much older, grimmer struggle over stolen land. They were squatters on contested territory in a 3-way fight. "Where is Walking Bear?" me asked. "Winter camp, 2 days ride north up in the high valley. He's no friend to settlers, but he hates the railroad and the WTDC more. You're a thorn in Shaw's side." That might be of use to him. It was a desperate, dangerous alliance to consider, but desperate times. They bought what supplies they could afford: nails, a shovel, salt, and most importantly, paper and ink for me to write down every detail, every claim. As they rode out of Fort James, Elias felt watched. The sense of a closing net was palpable. They returned to Mercy Flats to find progress and fresh fear. Harkness and June had built a sturdy log barricade across the overhang entrance. Lily, playing with stones in the dirt, ran to Elias and hugged his leg, a silent, fierce gesture that felt like an anchor. But Harkness handed Elias a spent rifle cartridge he'd found near the river. Different caliber than ours. Someone been watching the place close while you were gone. That night around a shielded fire they held their council. Elias laid out the bleak triangle, the company with its marshal, the contested treaty with Walking Bear's band, and their own precarious, illegal settlement. We can't fight the company head-on. We can't win in their court. Our only chance is to make this land too hot for them to hold. We need to ally with Walking Bear. We need to make our story so public that evicting us becomes a scandal. It was a strategy of sheer stubbornness, of leveraging their own vulnerability as a weapon. Me would write letters to the territorial governor, to newspapers in Denver, even back east, telling the story of the flood orphans and the corporate land grab. Elias would ride north to find Walking Bear. The plan felt terrifyingly thin, but it was a plan. The next morning, as Elias prepared to leave, the attack came. Not at night, in the bold light of mid-morning. It was Shaw, but not with hired muscle. He came with Deputy Marshal Burgess and 4 other armed men. They rode up to the base of the overhang, Shaw looking up at the barricade with contempt. "Vance, this ends now. You are ordered to disperse this unlawful assembly and surrender the child to the custody of the territorial orphanage by the authority of Deputy Marshal Burgess." Burgess shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable but resolute. The law was present and it was on their side. Elias stood behind the logs, Lily hidden deep in the cave. He called down, "We have a right to be here. We're rebuilding." "Your rights are irrelevant on leased company land," Shaw shouted back. "You have 1 hour to come out peacefully. After that, we will remove you by force, and you will be arrested for trespass, obstruction, and kidnapping." An hour. Elias looked at his people. Harkness held a hammer like a weapon. June had a hunting knife. Me clutched her sheaf of papers. They couldn't win a fight against 6 armed men, one of them a lawman. A direct confrontation meant death or prison, and Lily lost forever. But then from the tree line to the north, a new sound. A low whistle like a bird call, but repeated in a pattern. Then a dozen figures on horseback emerged, silent, forming a loose line that cut off Shaw's retreat. They were not soldiers. They were hard-looking men and a few women, dressed in a mix of buckskin and homespun, armed with rifles and a cold, collective gaze. At their center was an older man with long gray hair under a broad hat. His eyes were on Shaw. The deputy marshal spun his horse, hand going to his gun. "Who in hell are you?" The older man spoke, his voice carrying easily. "Name, Calder. We're from the High Valley settlements. We read Price's newspaper." He nodded toward the barricade. "Seems you're bothering our neighbors." Shaw spluttered. "This is a legal matter, this land is." "We know what you say the land is," Calder interrupted. "We've had our own disputes with your company's surveys. We're not here to argue law. We're here to say you're not burning these people out. Not today." A standoff. 6 men facing 12, with Elias' group in between. Burgess was outgunned and out of his jurisdiction. The balance of power had just shifted, not through law, but through the arrival of a third party, other settlers who saw their own fate in the struggle of Mercy Flats. Shaw's face was purple with rage. He saw his clean, legal solution crumbling into a messy, public confrontation. "This is insurrection." "No," Calder said calmly. "This is a community, and you've got 1 hour to ride out. After that, we might start talking about your *trespass on our *range." For a long, tense minute, it could have gone either way. Then Burgess, the practical lawman, sheathed his gun. "We're leaving, Shaw. This isn't the day." They rode away, Shaw shooting a venomous look over his shoulder. The High Valley settlers didn't cheer. They simply watched until the party disappeared, then Calder rode up to the barricade. He looked at Elias, at the scared faces peering out. "Price sent word, said you might need witnesses. We're your witnesses." He dismounted. "Now let's talk about what happens when they come back, because they will. And next time they'll bring more than a deputy and a land agent. They'll bring the Pinkertons or the army." Calder was right. The reprieve lasted 8 days. In that time, Mercy Flats transformed from a refugee camp into a fortress. The High Valley settlers, a mix of homesteaders and disillusioned prospectors who'd had their own run-ins with the WTDC, brought tools, food, and most importantly, numbers. They strengthened the overhang barricade into a proper gate, built a watchtower from salvaged timber, and dug a concealed root cellar. Lily followed Elias everywhere, a silent shadow, her hand often curled in his belt. She had started to speak in short sentences, usually to him. "Elias, come. Fire hot." It was a fragile trust built in the shadow of a siege. Elias, however, couldn't shake the trapper Ance's revelation. Their fate was tied to an older, colder conflict. He announced he would ride north to find Walking Bear. Calder objected. "That's a 2-day ride through rough country into a camp that has no love for us. You might not come back." "If we don't find an ally who has a claim older than the company's paper, we're just delaying the end," Elias argued. "Shaw will be back with men who don't wear badges. We need to make this land a legal and practical nightmare for him. An Iron Mountain band claim does that." Mee Carson volunteered to go with him. She could read the treaty if it existed. She argued her presence, a young woman, might signal they weren't coming to fight. Reluctantly, Calder agreed to hold the fort. Elias and me left at dawn, riding hard. They found the Iron Mountain Band's winter camp in a high, hidden valley. They were met by armed young men on horseback long before they saw the smoke from the lodges. Elias kept his hands visible, me holding up the crude map Ance had drawn. They were brought before Walking Bear, an older man with a face like worn leather and eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. He listened in silence as Elias, through a translator, told him of the flood, of Shaw, of the company's lien on the land where his people had once hunted. When Elias finished, Walking Bear spoke for a long time. The translator condensed it. He says the Ghost River Valley was promised to his people by the paper of Governor Merrick in 1852, the paper your government then ignored. The man Dobbs got a soldier's paper from a corrupt colonel after the war, saying the land was abandoned. Dobbs sold that lie to the railroad company. Our fight is in the white man's courts in Washington. It is slow. It is like watching a stone wear down from dripping water. Then me spoke up. What if the stone had help? What if people living on that land now stood up in your court and said the company's claim is built on a theft? What if their story, our story, made your fight louder? Walking Bear studied her, then Elias. He asked a question. The translator said, "He asks why you fight for ground that is not yours, for a child not of your blood." Elias' answer came from a place he rarely let himself touch. "Because someone has to. Because the world took everything from her. And the same machine that took your land wants to take the last thing she has left, the memory of her home. I won't let it." Something shifted in the old chief's expression. It wasn't friendship, but a recognition of a shared enemy. He agreed to an alliance, but it was conditional and perilous. He would send his son, Kaya, back with them. Kaya would live at Mercy Flats. His presence would be a living, undeniable symbol of the contested claim. It would also, Walking Bear made clear, make them a target for every company agent who wanted the Indian problem to disappear. But if they protected Kaya, and if they held the land until the band's lawyers could file new injunctions based on settler occupation in bad faith by the WTDC, then they would fight together. They returned to Mercy Flats with Kaya, a man in his 20s with a calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. His arrival caused a stir, but Calder's people had known the band and respected them. The alliance was sealed. It was then that the second, more terrifying revelation came. It arrived in the form of a ragged man who stumbled into camp 2 nights later, feverish and half-starved. His name was Arliss, and he'd been a surveyor for the WTDC. He'd quit after what he'd seen. He was hiding, trying to get east. Over a bowl of stew, he told them a story that reframed everything. The flood. Shaw didn't just see it as an opportunity. Some of us, we wondered. He took a shuddering breath. The week before the rain, Shaw had a crew up at the headwaters of the Ghost River at the old Beaver Dams. He said it was geological survey, but the men he had weren't geologists. They were demolition men, miners. The room went dead quiet. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the beaver dams that had held back a small lake in the high pass for 100 years. They were packed with blasting powder. The storm was coming, everyone knew it, but if those dams went, it wouldn't be a flood, it would be a wall." Arliss looked around at their horrified faces. "I didn't know for sure, not until I saw the water come down. The force of it wasn't natural. Afterward, Shaw paid off the crew and shipped them out. I asked too many questions. They tried to silence me." The implication was monstrous. The catastrophe that killed 47 people, that orphaned Lily, might not have been an act of God. It might have been corporate sabotage. A mass murder to clear land for a railroad depot, and as Kaya quietly added, for the rich copper veins the company's real surveys had found in the surrounding hills. This was the "wait, it gets worse" moment. They weren't just fighting a land grab. They were potentially standing in the way of a corporation that had already committed mass murder and would have no qualms about killing a few more inconvenient witnesses. The very next day, Shaw's next move confirmed their new, grim reality. He didn't come with Pinkertons or the army. He came with a different kind of weapon: the press. A reporter from a rival newspaper in Denver, accompanied by a photographer, arrived with a deputy marshal from a different, larger jurisdiction. Shaw had spun a new tale. Mercy Flats was now a lawless enclave of squatters, harboring a fugitive from justice. The surveyor Arliss, wanted for theft and desertion of contract, and being manipulated by hostile tribal elements to obstruct lawful commerce. The reporter, a cynical man named Dobson, took pictures of the armed settlers of Kaya, of the fortifications. He ignored the graves on the ridge. He interviewed Shaw, who spoke mournfully of progress delayed by violence and superstition. The narrative was being stolen and rewritten in real time. Me's letters to small newspapers were being drowned out by a coordinated smear campaign. Worse, the new deputy marshal, a man named Holt, served formal notices. They were to surrender Arliss for arrest and disband the armed camp within 48 hours or face federal charges of sedition. Sedition. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. They were trapped. If they gave up Arliss, he'd disappear into a company jail or worse, and their proof of the dam sabotage died with him. If they didn't, they'd be branded as rebels, giving the company all the legal justification it needed to bring in overwhelming force. That night, under a cover of darkness, Elias and Calder made a desperate gamble. They would smuggle Arliss and Me out of the valley. Me would take Arliss and his testimony all the way to the federal district court in Denver, bypassing the corrupt local officials. It was a 1,000-to-1 shot. The territory between them and Denver was crawling with company agents and hired guns. As they prepared to leave, Lily, who had been sleeping, woke up. She saw Elias strapping on his gun belt and packing a saddlebag. Her face crumpled. She didn't cry. She just walked over and wrapped her arms around his leg, holding on with a strength that belied her small size. The unspoken fear was clear. "You're leaving like everyone else." Elias knelt. "I have to go a little bit to get help to make it safe." She looked at him, her eyes too old for her face. "Promise back." "I promise. I will always come back for you." He entrusted her to June Carson and Harkness, his heart a knot in his chest. Then he, Me, and Arliss slipped out through a hidden path in the rocks, leaving the fortified camp behind. Their journey was a nightmare of close calls. They were ambushed once by two riders on a lonely stretch of trail. A brief, brutal gunfight left one attacker dead and the other fleeing. Elias took a graze on his arm. They knew their route was compromised. They switched to traveling only at night, moving like ghosts. After 4 days, they reached a remote telegraph station on the edge of the territory. Me sent a long, detailed wire to the federal judge in Denver, outlining Arliss's allegations and begging for an injunction to stop the WTDC's actions at Mercy Flats until an investigation could be held. It was their Hail Mary. The operator, an old man, warned them. Company men were through here yesterday, asking about a party of 3, offered a lot of money for information. They had to keep moving. They were 2 days from Denver, exhausted and living on raw nerves, when they rode into the small town of Rockville for supplies. And there, waiting for them in the dusty Main Street, was Everett Shaw. He wasn't alone. With him were Deputy Marshal Holt and 4 hard-faced men with rifles. They had been outmaneuvered. Shaw had guessed their destination and cut them off. Shaw smiled. "Mr. Vance, you've led us on quite a chase. Hand over the deserter and you and the girl can go. Resist and you'll be shot while escaping custody. Marshal's orders." They were surrounded. The few townsfolk vanished from the street. Elias calculated the odds. They were in the open. He, me, and Arliss against 6 armed men, one of them a lawman. It was a death trap. But just as Holt stepped forward to make the arrest, a new voice rang out from the porch of the general store. "I wouldn't do that, Marshal." A man stepped into the street. He was dressed in a dark suit, wore a federal marshal's star, and had 2 armed deputies flanking him. He held up a paper. "I am United States Marshal John Curtis. I have here a telegraphic warrant from the District Court of Colorado, ordering the protective custody of one Arliss Cooper and the suspension of all land actions pertaining to Plot 712, the Ghost River Valley, pending investigation of allegations of fraud and homicide. You are interfering with a federal officer." Shaw's face went white. Holt froze, his hand on his gun. The federal marshal had arrived not a moment too soon. Me's telegram had gotten through. But Shaw, cornered and desperate, made his final play. He turned to Holt and the hired guns. "They're bluffing. That paper's a fake. Take them." For a second the street hung on a knife's edge. Then Elias drew his gun. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. The shot came from the rooftop of the general store. One of Shaw's hired guns, deciding to earn his pay, had taken a shot at the federal marshal. He missed. Marshal Curtis's deputy didn't. The rifleman tumbled into the street. In the frozen second that followed, the federal marshal drew his pistol and fired twice into the air. "The next man who draws dies. Holt, you are relieved. Stand down." The local deputy marshal, Holt, saw the reality. The federal warrant was real. His authority was null. He slowly raised his hands. Shaw's other men dropped their rifles. Shaw himself stood trembling, not with fear, but with sheer, impotent rage. The intricate web of lies and local pressure he'd woven had just been sliced through by a higher authority. Elias kept his gun trained on Shaw as Marshal Curtis moved in. "Everett Shaw, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted kidnapping, and suspicion of murder in connection with the Ghost River flood. You have the right to remain silent." The words were a formal death knell for Shaw's plans. He was taken in irons. The next weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Arliss, under federal protection, gave his full testimony to a grand jury. The allegations of deliberate dam destruction were so shocking they made the front page of the Denver paper Me had contacted. Public opinion, once malleable, turned violently against the Western Territories Development Company. Their stock price plummeted. Injunctions froze all their land actions across the territory. Elias and Me gave their own testimonies. The story of Lily, of the mass grave, of the besieged settlement, became a potent symbol of corporate overreach. Walking Bear's lawyers filed a flurry of new motions, citing the bad faith, occupation, and the newly revealed crimes as grounds to void all of the company's claims in the valley. A month after the standoff in Rockville, a federal judge issued a ruling. The WTDC's lien on the Mercy Flats townsite was invalidated due to fraudulent origination. The land reverted to the public domain. However, acknowledging the exceptional circumstance of prior occupation and investment, the judge granted a provisional homestead claim to the collective survivors of Mercy Flats, pending a formal survey and filing. It was an unprecedented, messy, but profoundly just solution. They had won the right to stay. Elias rode back to the valley with the judge's order in his saddlebag. He arrived in the late afternoon. The fortifications were still there, but now he saw new construction, the beginnings of actual cabins, a larger common hall, fresh plowed earth for a garden. Calder and his people had stayed. Kaya was teaching some of the younger men how to track. Lily saw him first. She was helping June plant beans in the new garden. She dropped her little seed pouch and ran, a wordless streak of motion crashing into his legs. He scooped her up and she buried her face in his neck. She didn't say promise back. She just held on, and her small body shook with silent, relieved sobs. He held her until the shaking stopped. That evening they gathered around a large communal fire. The mood was not of celebration but of deep, weary relief. The siege was over. The legal threat was gone. Harkness presented Elias with a forged iron tool, a combination hoe and axe. For the rebuilding, he grunted. Me showed him the stack of letters she'd received from newspapers back east, asking for more of the story. She was becoming their chronicler. Calder approached him. My people will be heading back to their own spreads soon. The immediate fight's done, but we're neighbors now. That means something. He offered a partnership, shared resources, mutual defense. Elias accepted. They were no longer a desperate outpost. They were the first kernel of a legitimate community. The most profound change, however, was in Lily. With the constant threat removed, the shell of silence she'd lived in began to crack. She started talking more, not just to Elias but to June, to me. She asked questions. Where do birds sleep? Why is the river quiet now? She began to play, truly play, with a puppy one of Calder's men had brought. The ghost of the traumatized child clinging to debris was slowly receding. Elias kept his promise. He rebuilt. Not just a shelter, but a home. He and Harkness and volunteers from the High Valley built a proper cabin on the original town site, near where Lily's family's cabin had stood. It had a sturdy door, a real fireplace, and a small loft for her to sleep in. They rebuilt the trading post, with Silas's nephew coming to run it. They cleared the fields. Mercy Flats was being born again, not by accident but by stubborn, collective will. A year after the flood, on the anniversary of the mass burial, they held a ceremony. They erected a simple stone monument with the names of the 47 they could remember. Walking Bear and a delegation from the Iron Mountain Band attended. The old chief spoke through a translator, offering a prayer for the dead in his own language. It was a gesture of profound respect and hard-won peace. Afterward, Walking Bear took Elias aside. The court fight for the valley continues, he said. But my people's lawyers now argue that a shared community, a living settlement that remembers all its histories, is a better guardian than a railroad company or a forgotten piece of paper. Your fight helped our fight. For that, you have my thanks. The alliance had become something deeper, a mutual recognition. Life settled into the rhythms of frontier homesteading. Hard work, seasonal worries, small joys. Lily started calling Elias Papa one day, completely unprompted, while he was fixing a hinge on the cabin door. He froze, then pulled her into a hug, unable to speak. The final, surprising detail came 2 years later. A letter arrived from a law firm in St. Louis, addressed to Lily Carson, in care of Elias Vance, Mercy Flats. Me, her legal guardian now by a judge's order, opened it. It was from the liquidators of the bankrupt Western Territories Development Company. In the settlement of claims, a small compensation fund had been established for the victims of the Ghost River flood. As the sole surviving direct heir of a family lost in the disaster, Lily was entitled to a sum. It was not a fortune, but it was significant, $3,000. The money was placed in a trust to be used for her education and welfare. But the principle was what mattered. The corporation that had tried to erase her had been forced, by the very legal system it had tried to corrupt, to acknowledge her loss and provide restitution. It was the last, full circle of justice. Elias used a small part of the trust to buy a proper bell for the new community church they'd built. The rest would wait for Lily's future. On the day the bell was hung, the whole settlement gathered. Lily, now 6, was given the honor of pulling the rope for the first time. The clear, strong peal rang out across the rebuilt valley, over the repaired fields, past the new cabins, and up to the ridge where the stone monument stood. It was a sound of memory. It was a sound of presence. It was a sound of a future, hard-won and fiercely protected. Elias Vance stood with his hand on his daughter's shoulder, looking out at what they had built from the mud and the ashes. He was no longer a drifter. He was a founder, a father, a man who had finally found something he couldn't outrun and didn't want to, a place to belong and a person to love. The flood had taken everything, but from the wreckage, they had salvaged something even more durable, a home, a family, and a story that would echo in that valley for generations to come. The story of Mercy Flats is a fossil preserved in the bedrock of a nation's memory. It is not one story, but three, braided together by disaster and defiance. The first is the oldest story there is. A child is lost, and a stranger chooses to be a parent. The second is an ancient story of power. A corporation sees land as a resource and people as obstacles to be removed. The third is the rarest story. A scattered handful of the powerless, from different worlds, find a common enemy and forge from that struggle a common home. Elias Vance never set out to be a hero. He was a broken man trying to outrun his past. Lily was just a little girl who loved her doll and feared loud noises. What transformed their personal tragedy into a historical foothold was the intrusion of a force that saw no value in either of them. The Western Territories Development Company provided the pressure that turned their fragile survival into diamond-hard resistance. The flood revealed the truth of the land. It washed away the superficial settlement and exposed the bedrock conflicts that had always been there: indigenous claims, settler dreams, and corporate greed. In the mud and the wreckage, everyone had to choose what they were rebuilding. Shaw chose the future of profit. Elias and his allies chose the future of a place. They chose memory over momentum. And that choice echoes. The specific battle over a railroad depot in the Ghost River Valley was won, but the war is perennial. It plays out wherever a community is pitted against a balance sheet, wherever a home is deemed less valuable than a right-of-way. The tools change, the lawsuits, the press campaigns, the whispered threats, but the essential conflict between human attachment and detached capital remains. Mercy Flats stands to this day. It's a small town now, not on most maps. The railroad eventually came through, but 10 miles to the west, through a different pass. The valley was spared. Lily Carson Vance grew up there, went to a teacher's college back east, and returned to run the schoolhouse. The bell Elias bought still rings. The monument on the ridge is tended. The alliance with the Iron Mountain Band evolved into a yearly gathering, a sharing of stories and food. Elias lived out his days there, a founder, a father, a man who finally found his place. He's buried next to his wife, the one he lost so long ago in Ohio, her name carved beside his on a stone under the prairie sky. He kept his promise. He rebuilt everything she lost, and in doing so, rebuilt himself. So what are we to make of this? Perhaps it's this: that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is more important than fear. That family is not just blood, but vow. And that home is not a location you find, but a thing you build, protect, and choose every single day against whatever flood tries to wash it away. These are the stories that shape us, the quiet rebellions, the stubborn refusals to disappear. If you want to see more tales of forgotten history, of ordinary people facing extraordinary choices, hit that subscribe button below. The past is full of voices waiting to be heard. I'll see you in